Welcome to Tech Disruptions, deep dives into the technologies reshaping industries, from AI to quantum to biotech. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let me get this straight. As we're sitting here talking, right now, there are 4 astronauts in deep space headed for a fiery re-entry. And the one thing standing between them and incineration is a heat shield that fundamentally failed its only previous flight test?
That's right. The Artemis II crew, Commander Reed Wiseman and his 3 crewmates, they launched just 2 days ago, April 1st, 2026. They're on a 10-day free return trajectory around the moon, and in about a week, around April 10th, they're going to hit Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, generating temperatures of 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The Avcoat heat shield on their Orion capsule is their only hope.
And this Avcoat heat shield, it didn't just underperform on the Artemis I uncrewed flight, it catastrophically failed, blowing chunks off like some kind of space popcorn?
Space popcorn is a pretty vivid way to put it, but yeah, it's not far off. The post-flight inspections of that Artemis I capsule revealed more than 100 distinct locations where large pieces of the heat shield had just broken away unexpectedly. This isn't a small deviation, it's a fundamental design flaw that could turn their spacecraft into a plasma torch.
That is terrifying. So NASA saw this, and their response was, let's put humans on the next one? How do you even begin to justify that?
That's exactly the billion-dollar question we need to answer. It's a gamble, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
All right, let's unpack this. Because when we talk about a heat shield failure, for someone who isn't a rocket scientist, what does that actually mean? You mentioned spalling. Can you paint a picture of what happens when that heat shield hits the atmosphere?
Absolutely. Imagine this. The Orion capsule is hurtling through the atmosphere. The whole point of an ablative heat shield, like Avcoat, is that it's designed to burn away slowly and smoothly. Think of it like a sacrificial layer. It erodes, carrying heat away from the spacecraft, keeping the crew capsule cool. It's literally designed to char and disappear in a controlled fashion.
So a smooth, graceful erosion, like sanding wood, not chipping concrete.
Exactly. Now, what happened on Artemis I was the opposite. It experienced severe spalling. Instead of that smooth erosion, the material violently cracked and ejected in irregular chunks. Imagine dropping a ceramic plate on the floor and it shatters. That's closer to what happened, but at 25,000 miles per hour.
And what's the danger there? I mean, a chunk comes off. Is that just cosmetic, or is it a structural integrity issue?
Oh, it's absolutely not cosmetic. When a chunk of heat shield blows out, it leaves a void, a divot. That drastically alters the hypersonic aerodynamics of the capsule. Think of it like a perfectly smooth aerodynamic car suddenly having huge gouges in its side. That creates localized turbulence, and when you're talking about superheated plasma, that turbulence creates hotspots.
Hotspots, where the heat isn't distributed evenly?
Precisely. Those hotspots can accelerate heating in that specific area, leading to a catastrophic burn-through of the capsule's underlying structure. It's not just that a little bit of the shield is gone, it's that the entire thermal barrier is compromised, creating weak points where the 5,000-degree plasma can literally melt through the spacecraft.
And the source material highlights not just the spalling, but 2 other fatal flaws that emerged from Artemis I. One involves the separation bolts. This sounds incredibly sensitive.
It is. The Orion crew module is connected to the European service module by 4 massive separation bolts. These aren't just any bolts. They penetrate the Avcoat heat shield. To protect them, they're packed with a thermal barrier material. The problem is, metal conducts heat differently than the resin in the heat shield, making them highly sensitive failure points.
So if that thermal barrier fails,
On Artemis I, 3 of the 4 bolts melted entirely through their thermal barriers. The heating model used to design them was fundamentally flawed. If a bolt melts through, it creates a channel, a direct path for that 5,000-degree plasma to ingest straight into the spacecraft. That would exceed structural limits, essentially tearing the vehicle apart from the inside, leading to a loss of crew.
so we've got chunks of heat shield flying off, potential burn-through, and these bolts that could become plasma channels. And the third flaw is almost comically frustrating. The parachutes?
Yes, the parachutes. The concern is that when spalling occurs, those hard chunks of heat shield material are ejected into the hypersonic airstream. They could strike the top of the capsule, where the parachutes are stored, and potentially destroy the parachute compartment.
Wait, so debris from the heat shield could rip up the parachutes before they even deploy? That would be a double failure.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. We don't know if that happened on Artemis I. Why? Because NASA failed to recover the parachutes or the parachute cover from the Pacific Ocean, despite making elaborate plans to do so. The evidence that could have confirmed or denied this critical failure mode is literally sitting at the bottom of the sea. It's the ultimate unknown unknown for this mission.
So we have a heat shield that blew up, structural bolts that melted, and we don't even know if the parachutes were damaged because the evidence is gone. And NASA's initial reaction to all of this was triumph?
Oh, absolutely. Following the December 2022 splashdown, NASA's immediate posture was one of overwhelming triumph. They celebrated the mission as a resounding success, declined to publish the post-flight assessment review for months, and then, when they finally did address the anomalies, they sanitized the language to an incredible degree.
Sanitized? So how do you talk about 100 deep gouges and melted bolts in a sanitized way?
Well, in March 2023, the Orion program manager, Howard Hugh, held a press briefing. He admitted there were anomalies, but used phrases like, "We observed there were more variations across the heat shield than we expected, and some of the expected char material ablated away differently than what our computer models and what our ground testing predicted."
Variations? Ablated away differently? That sounds like a sophisticated way of saying it broke.
It does. And he insisted it was not a safety issue and that there was a significant amount of margin. Then, in January 2024, Moon to Mars Deputy Administrator Amit Kshatriya continued the narrative, telling reporters the damage was limited to very small localized areas, and there was a healthy margin remaining. It was textbook corporate speak designed to downplay existential threats.
Healthy margin? This is like saying your car has a healthy margin after its brakes failed on the test track. But then the independent watchdog stepped in, didn't it? The OIG report?
That's where the PR spin violently collided with reality. On May 1, 2024, the NASA Office of the Inspector General, OIG, published an audit titled NASA's Readiness for the Artemis II Crewed Mission to Lunar Orbit. The OIG is an independent government watchdog, and their report was devastating.
And it wasn't just words, was it? They had evidence.
They published actual photographs of the heat shield damage. These weren't variations, these were deep, terrifying gouges that completely contradicted the small, localized areas narrative. The OIG didn't pull any punches. Their stark conclusion was that the Artemis I test flight revealed anomalies with the Orion heat shield, separation bolts, and power distribution that pose significant risks to the safety of the crew.
Significant risks to the safety of the crew. That's a far cry from healthy margin, and they specifically called out the bolts too.
Yes, the OIG report explicitly warned that the separation bolt melting could expose the vehicle to hot gas ingestion behind the heat shield, exceeding Orion's structural limits and resulting in the breakup of the vehicle and loss of crew. That's not engineering jargon. That's a direct warning of a catastrophic outcome. This is where you see the stark contrast between NASA management's sanitizing language and the blunt, undeniable truth presented by an independent body. If the OIG hadn't forced their hand with photographic evidence, would NASA have ever admitted the true severity of the Artemis I damage? It really makes you wonder.
It feels like they were trying to just sweep it under the rug, and it sounds eerily familiar to anyone who knows the history of NASA's past disasters.
That's where the comparison becomes chillingly direct. What we're seeing aren't just engineering problems. They're organizational and psychological failures that echo the Challenger and Columbia disasters. And the loudest alarms are coming from inside the house, from people who lived through those tragedies.
You're talking about Charles Camarda, the former astronaut and thermal engineer. He's been incredibly vocal about this.
Yes, Charles Camarda is a 73-year-old retired NASA astronaut, a thermal engineer with a PhD, and the former director of engineering at Johnson Space Center. This isn't just some disgruntled former employee. He flew on the Return to Flight Space Shuttle mission in 2005, the first mission after Columbia. He knows, intimately, what happens when heat shields fail, and he has broken ranks to publicly state that Artemis II is unsafe.
And his assessment is incredibly blunt. He said, "I don't think NASA should be flying a crew on this vehicle." That's a pretty damning statement from someone with his background.
It absolutely is. He calls it a deviant heat shield. And what's crucial is his assessment of NASA's culture right now. He told CNN, and I'm quoting here, "The way they're attacking the problem is echoes of Challenger and Columbia, using exactly the same bad behaviors to understand the physics of the problem. They're not using a research-based approach."
Same bad behaviors. That's a gut punch. And it brings up this concept from Maciej Kogłowski, the tech writer, which I think is just brilliant. Epistemic fig leaves. What does he mean by that in this context?
Kogłowski coined that phrase to describe NASA's justification for flying Artemis II. Because they can't afford the time or money to physically test a new heat shield design, which is what you'd expect after a failure, they built computer simulations. He calls them toy models. These models are supposed to prove the current flawed heat shield is safe.
So they're using software to fix a hardware problem that they can't afford to physically fix.
Exactly. But here's the catch, and Kogłowski points this out. They are using the exact same analytical frameworks that failed to predict the spalling in 2022 to now assure us that spalling won't happen in 2026. Management then uses these pseudo-quantitative models to create a false sense of security. It looks like math, it feels like science, but it's just a fig leaf. It's a way to cover a decision that's already been made, driven by schedule pressure, not genuine scientific validation.
That is such a powerful phrase. It's like a company launching a product, knowing there are fundamental flaws, but building a fancy AI model to prove it'll be fine because they can't delay the launch.
It's the perfect analogy, and it aligns directly with what Admiral Harold Gehman, who chaired the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, warned about. The KIB famously concluded that NASA's organizational culture had as much to do with the Columbia accident as the physical foam strike. When rigid schedules meet immovable budgets, organizations inevitably cut into margin. They normalize deviance.
Normalize deviance. That's a chilling concept, where a known anomaly slowly becomes an acceptable risk over time.
Precisely. Just as foam falling off the shuttle external tank went from an existential threat to a maintenance issue over years, Orion's heat shield chunks blowing off went from a catastrophic failure to an expected variation, or a healthy margin, in NASA's own sanitized language. It's the psychology of disaster, where smart people in rooms talk themselves into doing dangerous things because the institutional pressure is immense.
It's like the agency itself is experiencing cognitive dissonance, isn't it? On one hand, they admit the problem, but on the other, they push forward with the same hardware. Which brings us to the fix, if you can call it that. It sounds less like a fix and more like a band-aid.
That's a very accurate description. In late 2024, NASA finally announced the root cause of the Artemis I spalling. The avcoat material was not sufficiently permeable. During re-entry, gases formed inside the material. Because the resin was too dense, the expanding gases couldn't vent out. Pressure built up, and the material explosively popped, ejecting chunks of the shield.
Okay, so the shield needs to breathe. It's like a pressure cooker.
Exactly. Now, here's the dark irony, and this is truly mind-blowing. The heat shield attached to the Artemis II capsule, the one currently in space, was manufactured years ago. And to make it easier for technicians to perform ultrasonic testing on the shield prior to launch, NASA actually manufactured the Artemis II avcoat to be even less permeable than the Artemis I version.
Wait, so the problem was insufficient permeability, and they are flying a heat shield that is even less permeable than the one that failed? That's not just a band-aid. That's like putting a tighter lid on the pressure cooker.
It's an astounding detail, isn't it? The crew is flying on a shield that is theoretically more susceptible to the exact failure mode NASA identified as the root cause. Of course, replacing the Artemis II heat shield would mean dismantling the fully stacked Orion capsule, costing billions and delaying the program by years. That wasn't an option.
So if they couldn't fix the hardware, they fixed the math?
They fixed the math and the trajectory. Artemis I flew a skip re-entry, which is where the capsule dips into the atmosphere, bounces out to cool, and then comes back in. NASA claims this dual heating phase exacerbated the gas buildup. So for Artemis II, they've altered the trajectory to a steeper, more direct loft descent. Their toy models now claim this new trajectory will prevent the spalling.
But they're essentially flying a simulation to fix a physical problem they know is there. And they're not even convinced of their own fix, are they? Because they've already admitted they're redesigning the heat shield for Artemis III.
Exactly. NASA has simultaneously announced that for Artemis III, they are completely redesigning the heat shield to fix the permeability issue. They are effectively admitting the current design is a dead end, a flawed system, but forcing the Artemis II crew to fly it anyway, relying on a trajectory workaround and a computer model to save them.
This brings up such a glaring double standard. Think about how NASA treats its commercial partners, like SpaceX or Boeing. If a Crew Dragon capsule came back with 100 gouges and melted bolts, what would happen?
Oh, it's night and day. NASA regulates commercial partners like SpaceX and Boeing with an iron fist. If a SpaceX Dragon capsule returned from orbit with 100 deep gouges in its heat shield and 3 melted structural bolts, NASA's Commercial Crew Program would immediately ground the entire fleet. They would mandate a root cause analysis, a total hardware redesign, and a mandatory uncrewed flight test to validate the fix before allowing humans back on board. That's standard operating procedure for any commercial crew vehicle.
But for their own program, their flagship, it's a different rulebook.
Absolutely, because SLS and Orion are NASA's own, politically sensitive, multi-billion-dollar programs. They are effectively waiving their own rules. They're accepting the risk and skipping the uncrewed test flight that any commercial partner would be forced to conduct. They're grading their own homework, and the curve is incredibly generous.
So why? Why take this unnecessary risk? Because operationally, there's no real need for a crew on this particular mission, is there?
That's the most frustrating aspect of Artemis II. Operationally, there is zero necessity for a crew to be on board right now. Originally, Artemis II was supposed to be a crewed shakedown before the Artemis III lunar landing, but due to delays with SpaceX's human landing system and spacesuit development, Artemis III has already been pushed out to at least 2027 and even downgraded to a near-Earth orbit docking test.
So they could have easily just flown Artemis II uncrewed, validated this new trajectory, tested the heat shield, and risked 0 lives.
Exactly. They could have used it to safely validate this new loft re-entry trajectory and test the heat shield without risking 4 lives. Why didn't they? The answer, unfortunately, comes down to money, pride, and politics. It's the classic sunk cost fallacy playing out on a multi-billion-dollar scale.
The financial black hole, as it's been called.
According to the May 2024 OIG report, NASA will have spent more than $55 billion on the SLS rocket, Orion capsule, and ground systems by the end of 2025. If you factor in the legacy costs from the Constellation program, from which Orion was born, the sunk cost approaches $100 billion. Each launch of this system costs roughly $4 billion. That's a staggering amount of taxpayer money.
And there's the international race, too, with China aiming for the moon.
Absolutely. China's National Space Administration is aggressively pursuing a crewed lunar landing by 2030, and they are consistently hitting their developmental milestones. NASA is under a strict political mandate from Congress to land Americans on the moon before January 2029.
So flying Artemis II empty would be seen as a public admission of failure.
Precisely. It would signal to Congress that this $55 billion-plus investment has yielded a defective spacecraft. That would invite budget cuts, potential program cancellation threats, and a massive loss of face. To save the program, NASA management, it appears, has decided to risk the crew. It's a calculated, if terrifying, political gamble.
And it's a gamble that's playing out right now, above our heads. These 4 astronauts are in deep space, unaware of how tenuous their return journey might be.
That's the real-time suspense of this whole situation. The SLS rocket did its job 2 days ago. The Orion capsule is functioning perfectly in the vacuum of space. But the true test, the one that matters most, hasn't even begun yet.
Around April 10th.
Yes, around April 10th, Commander Reed Wiseman and his crew will hit the Earth's atmosphere. They will be relying on a trajectory workaround, a toy model calculation, and a heat shield that is known to be defective and, ironically, made less permeable than the one that failed. The world will be watching to see if NASA's billion-dollar gamble pays off, or if the ghosts of Challenger and Columbia have returned to haunt the agency, not as a historical footnote, but as a present-day tragedy.
It's just incredible to think about the layers of institutional pressure, the scientific justification that seems to be paper thin, and then the sheer physical reality of what they're about to face. So the key takeaways here for me are clearly the known physical flaws of that heat shield, the institutional gaslighting and denial that followed the first test, and then this deeply concerning pattern of normalizing deviance when faced with schedule and budget pressure. It's a stark reminder of how easily, even with the best intentions, organizations can put their people in harm's way for reasons that have little to do with safety.
And you have to layer on top of that the hypocrisy of how NASA treats its own internal programs versus its commercial partners. It's a clear double standard. And ultimately, it comes down to the sunk cost fallacy and political optics overriding what should be a safety-first approach.
Absolutely. Which begs the question for our listeners, if this mission does come back safely, does that actually vindicate NASA's decision-making? Or does it just prove they got lucky playing Russian roulette with human lives? And what lessons can any organization take from this about the dangers of relying on epistemic fig leaves and pushing ahead with known flaws simply because the launch date is set in stone? It's a question every tech company, every project manager should be asking themselves.
That's all for this episode of Tech Disruptions. Join us next time as we keep exploring the technologies reshaping our world. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Stay curious out there.